Well, hi there. Welcome to this edition of the Don McKeag Show, which will be dealing with Memorial Day as this weekend is coming up, and also a personal involvement a little bit with another very big day for me and for so many of us in Massachusetts. The 100th birthday would have been this Monday, Memorial Day, for President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, we have so much going on that's controversial, and it has to stop, at least for a while, I believe, to bring us together. And Memorial Day, to me, is the perfect time for all of us to be grateful, to be thankful for our country and for all those in it. We have been, I think, led down a path specifically to create news rather than to heal differences in opinions, race, and other things. But that's not what I want to talk about. I've got a lot to say, and I hope you will enjoy this show as I do every show. I am also on the radio, as I have been for 20 years. I used to be on WXTK on Cape Cod, which I have many listeners in Carver and in Plymouth and in Halifax. I believe you can get the show, but it's Saturdays, every Saturday from 11 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. We talk about what I'm going to talk about today, the real world, the conservative world, but on top of that, to try to inform. I was a former high school teacher and coach, and I've always missed education. I've missed being able to try to inform young people and older people about what I see as the truth from the standpoint of what I've read and what I've experienced. But to start with, I want to also talk about the history of America and those who came here from different countries. I always refer to Martin Luther, who was the Catholic priest, devoted Catholic priest in Germany, who took on the entire Catholic hierarchy. Not the religion, not the people, but he saw the corruption in the Catholic Church and wanted it stopped, and jeopardized his own personal safety, his own personal life, and was willing to do that to bring back the true meaning of Christianity. Christianity, of course, then developed into the Protestant Reformation, so there was an alternative to the Catholic religion. But he never did this for that purpose. We now have to stand for what we believe in and what we've been brought up in. And Martin Luther left us with, in 1583, the following. Cowardice asked the question, is it safe? Expediency asked the question, is it politic? Vanity asked the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular. He or she must take that position because they believe it is right. We must stand up. As the old expression said, those who don't stand for something will fall for anything. Now, Memorial Day is this coming Monday, the 29th. And for those that don't remember, or the younger people, I hope we have some young people that will stay on, listen to this old timer, try to share some of his experiences. But it was begun as Decoration Day following the Civil War. It was begun by General John Sloan, who wanted to, as did so many people, wanted to remember the fallen soldiers in the Civil War. So it was 1868, but again it was called Decoration Day. It did not become Memorial Day until the 20s or the late 1800s, I'm not sure of that. But what have we got out here? We got some noise. Can they hear that? Oh, yeah, okay. They're doing the parking lot, not trying to get us off the air, I don't think. Is that right, Will? But anyway, excuse me. So it was, there were 400,000 graves there are now in Arlington Cemetery, and of course, this is a huge turnout of people. There's a tremendous traffic that goes on down there this coming weekend. And President Lyndon Johnson, ironically, of course, who inherited the presidency upon the death of John Kennedy, made it called the official birthplace of this holiday in Waterloo, New York, on May of 1966. Flanders Field poem, which was written in 1915, inspired the use of the poppies, where poppies grow, where fields of poppies grow, and the red. And then in 1915, Moira Michael wrote her own poem called, and this was it, "We cherish too the poppy red that grows on fields where valor led. It seems to signal to the skies that the blood of heroes never dies." Now, one of the things I do want to also remind us, and it bothers me because Memorial Day, unfortunately, has been too often considered just a long weekend, time for cookouts, hot dogs, relatives, and the real purpose of it is to remember all of our soldiers from all of our wars. And at 3 p.m., this law was passed. Well, it's not a law, it's a suggestion, but it's on the docket of Washington, excuse me, instructions, that at 3 o'clock every Memorial Day, we are all, games, other things, are all supposed to be suspended for a short time to honor those wonderful people who gave their lives so that we can have a Memorial Day. Now, every town has usually celebrated Memorial Day, and I remember in Weymouth, I was born and brought up in Weymouth, Massachusetts, close by. My grandparents actually had a camp in Halifax, way back. But I just want to reminisce a little about what it was like back in the 50s and 40s as a young boy. We had a Mr. William Seach. He was only about 5'2", and he was born and brought up in Weymouth himself. And he had fought in the Spanish-American War and had saved 3 sailors in Havana Harbor from burning ships. He was only about 5 feet 3 inches tall. And in my whole memory of Weymouth, he lived into his 90s, and he led the parade in Weymouth, the Memorial Day parade, every year for so many of those years. I don't remember when he was no longer able, but he was in his 80s and marching. And he won the Congressional Medal of Honor by pulling injured, near-death sailors from ship in Havana Harbor and swimming them to safety. An amazing, amazing man, but it's amazing how many stories there are like that that make Memorial Day such an important time. So I hope you will tell your children and grandchildren, brothers and sisters, to take a few minutes to either visit a cemetery or to just take some moments in the backyard to remember all those who gave us everything we have. Now, the other thing that I had mentioned that I really have, I hope, some interesting things to talk about is the birthday of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, ironically, I just mentioned to you about my radio show from 11 to 1 every Saturday going back 20 plus years. And when I first got the job from Ernie Bach Sr., now you remember, you see the ads still for cars that his son Ernie Bach Jr. has, but at that time the father, who became a billionaire, by the way, he had, of course, a lot of stations and auto dealerships, different kinds. Subaru were the big ones, I think, from his importing. But anyway, he came into my restaurant. I was in the restaurant business, and asked me if I'd like to try radio. He bought a radio station, which is still WXTK, and he wanted it to be all talk radio, which it is still. And he wanted me to be on an afternoon show, which I said, oh, I'll try it. So I did. And the second day I was on, there was another girl that was on who had been on for a couple of years. And she, believe it or not, my second day on the job, now imagine, just like now, sitting here talking. I'm used to it now after all those years, but I wasn't then. And she had an auto accident coming in and couldn't make it to the show, and I was there by myself. And I had brought a few notes, but I was really, put it this way, scared. How am I going to pull this off? But one of the notes was that it would have been Joseph P. Kennedy's 100th birthday. Now that tells you the irony now that I'm talking about this, about the son, John. So I'll always remember, I believe it was September 7th, and it was 1998. I think Mr. Kennedy was born in 1898. But anyway, so little did I know that what I asked the audience was if they thought having President Kennedy, now he was long gone, of course, and as Bobby Kennedy had been killed also, but I had become a good friend. I had met and become a friend of Senator Ted Kennedy. And so it was very ironic that I would be on this show and living in Hyannisport at the time, and I knew what the neighbors felt about the traffic and the buses that continue going through there, of course, with the popularity of the fallen president. So my question was, did people, the listeners in the audience, think that it was a positive to have had the Kennedys live on Cape Cod? And that's how I kept the story going, but I didn't get any calls. And I was sweating bullets, and when we took breaks for the ads, I went out and got water, and the manager came down and said, gee, you're doing, I said, great. I haven't had one call. And so he informed me, which has helped me throughout, is that yes, calls are important. We do a lot of calls down on the Cape. Here, we don't have that format, obviously. But he said when people are listening, they don't want to call because they want to hear more of what you're saying. And hopefully, that's the case as I babble on here today. But anyway, so I then, of course, had spent a lot of time in the House. And I remember very much the first day that I went to the Kennedy home, and the senator asked me to play the piano. I played piano, and he had parties, and I was always invited. But he and I went sailing a lot, and I got to see all of the real pictures, not the ones that are in the magazines, but the real ones. And it was very moving. Now, I was at the University of Massachusetts when the president was shot. I was practice teaching, and I still didn't believe it. Two girls came to class late, and I said, where have you been? And they said, oh, the president's been shot. And my stomach didn't accept it, and I said, that's a terrible thing to say. And they ran off crying down the halls. And then I realized that this was the truth, and I was really, really upset. Now, you must remember, for those of us that live in Massachusetts and those that are old enough to remember what it was like then. I was 20 years old when he was killed. His family had lived on Cape Cod since 1928. They've been taxpayers in Massachusetts longer than 1928 because the president was born in Brookline, and that's where his father and mother first lived. So they were real Massachusetts natives. He was Irish, I'm Irish. He was Catholic, I'm Catholic. He was witty, I'm maybe witty, but he had this wonderful, wonderful way about him. And for those of us in our 20s, he was the only young leader in the whole world. Winston Churchill was in Britain, 86, although I don't know if he was still prime minister. Charles de Gaulle in France was 76. Eisenhower was 72, the previous president. It goes on and on. Konrad Adenauer in Germany was 74. So it was so exciting for those of us in the real bloom of our life in college and getting out, starting into the new world, to see a president that had so many of those things that we could identify with. He had young children, a beautiful wife, and again, he spoke so wonderfully and so wittily. So it was a tremendous, tremendous shock and a tremendous loss. Forget party politics, as we should today. You hear me talk, I have no use for either party in the politics. I care about this country. And John Fitzgerald is known for many quotations, but the one at his inaugural address was, "Ask not what your country is going to do for you. What are you going to do for your country?" Now that ties right in. I'm a very spiritual, not so much religious, but very spiritual person. But it shouldn't go unnoticed that Memorial Day and his 100th birthday are at the same time, because all of the soldiers that I've just mentioned, the recent ones that come back injured and loss of limbs. You see the commercials on television, the wounded warriors and asking for help and money. And I hope you do. I try to give as much as I can to those who should be remembered for their sacrifices. And I also remembered being ashamed of what so many young people were doing over the Vietnam War. President Lyndon Johnson wouldn't run again because he had churned up so much dislike, so much animus that we have today, which is unfortunate because it does no good. It divides people. But the point still is that I don't mind any group of people protesting when they protest in an orderly, respectful manner. But all the way back to 1968, 69, that's why Bobby Kennedy was running for president. There were some who were allowed, and I'm sorry, I will now get into the politics for a brief minute, and that is when you spit on these young men and now young women who have just jeopardized, lost their lives or lost limbs or had mental breakdowns that they can never recover from, when you spit on them, you are in the wrong and you should be punished. That being said, so this was the exciting time of the Kennedys. And Matt, this might be a good time. I was given some pictures. Some you've seen. I just wanted to show you a couple. But the one on my right here is of the three brothers, and it was taken in front of the fence on the street. I lived on the same street, Irving Avenue in Hyannisport, as the president's house was. And the bottom is one that Senator Ted gave me. And then this one on the left, you'll never see. This was given to me by a very fine lady who just auctioned off, you may have seen it on Fox, but John Kennedy, she worked for him back in 1959 while he was still a senator, which is the only time, well, I saw him one other time sailing, but I never met him, but I remember seeing him leaving Mass and being so impressed. There was an aura about him. But this is a picture that she gave me that you won't see. I've never seen it before, and it's an actual photo from a friend of hers who is now doing some photos. But recently, anyway, President Kennedy, for whatever reason, gave her the only diary that he ever kept prior to his presidency or during his presidency. And it went for $719,000 at auction, April, I think it was April 20th or something. And it was bought by a very wealthy former writer, and I believe it will end up in the library. But this is the kind of actual experiences that I carry around, but I also want to share them, not to make myself elevated. That's not my purpose. My purpose, hopefully, is to bring back those times, bring back how joyful it was and what would happen when he would come down to the Cape, and how people just thronged around him. Well, they thronged around wherever he went. Some of the other sayings that I'd like to have us remember. One of the things that bothers me as a teacher, these are the things that are all churning in my mind as I was preparing for this show, and hopefully they will fit somehow into a part of this dialogue. The educational system has gone so politically correct that they have really torn our country apart, especially in the collegiate area and in our young people. You know, we're not supposed to just lockstep. Never have I said that. But we're not also supposed to be disrespectful, and we're not also supposed to shape the minds of our college people against or for someone based on their political opinions, meaning the teachers. Now, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, one of the men that wrote so beautifully in the Declaration, and all, he was contributory to all of the major documents that keep this country, or are supposed to keep this country, focused on our successful political system. Remember, no matter what you hear from the mainstream media, who are negative for their own personal reasons, that is ratings, getting people to now listen to them to see how outrageous they can be. But more importantly, our young people are supposed to know the facts, and they're supposed to form their own opinions. John F. Kennedy, were he here today, would not be part of the Democratic echelon. Now, I was a Democrat 2/3 of my life, voting life. I said earlier, I don't care for either political party, nor do millions of others who voted for President Trump. The problem is those people in the Washington elite never thought it was going to happen, and they are like spoiled children. John Kennedy never, and as I said, ask not what your country's going to do for you. What are you going to do for your country? How absolute is that against what we have today in a welfare state where people are told they can come here illegally? John Kennedy, let me tell you, they are going to, for this next weekend, watch the media. They're going to make John Kennedy out to be the greatest Democrat ever. He did this, he did that, all of which were under totally different situations, and they were never followed and are not being followed now. Well, Thomas Jefferson is vilified now in the educational elite because he owned slaves. We no longer have an Abraham Lincoln Day. We have a Martin Luther King holiday, which we should. But Abraham Lincoln, who basically freed the slaves, no notice for him. George Washington, the father of the country, who every historian, those for and against, has said without George Washington, there would not be an America. No celebration of Washington's birthday like there was when I was young. Not right. Well, John F. Kennedy, when he was president, held a dinner at the White House for a group of the brightest minds in the nation at the time. At this dinner, he stood and made this statement. I quote, "This is perhaps the assembly of the most intelligence ever to gather at one time in the White House, with the exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." That's how much John Kennedy believed in and admired Thomas Jefferson. The other thing that not many reporters will stress is the fact that John Kennedy was a sickly young man. His bad health was referenced every now and then, but it was hidden purposely so that people wouldn't be worried, and also so it wouldn't jeopardize his presidency. He was running for re-election when he was killed. But when you take all of Thomas Jefferson's, for instance, Thomas Jefferson said this, think about how this applies to today. All tyranny needs to gain a foothold is for people of good conscience to remain silent. That's what we have now. That's why I read Martin Luther. Conscience. When conscience tells you it is right, that's when you act. Those that are protecting their jobs, protecting their political establishment, but don't believe in it, they are jeopardizing the entire foundation of this country. So John Kennedy admired a lot of people, especially Winston Churchill. Now, just to show you how fickle and why I don't believe in political parties anymore, not that I ever did, is because Winston Churchill despised John Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, who was the ambassador to the King's Court during World War II, leading up to and during, until he was called home by then President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was against Britain getting in the war. He was against America getting in the war. And he had plenty of company, by the way, Mr. Kennedy. But Winston Churchill despised him. John Kennedy, on the other hand, being sickly, read a lot. He read and he traveled. And this is why I believe he was so effective and would have been a second term a very effective president. Who knows? He did get us involved in Vietnam, but I honestly believe he would have gotten us out of there. Those who don't know the story, of course, he was the captain of a PT boat that was smashed by a Japanese destroyer, and 2 men died, but he saved 2, and I don't know how, being as frail as he was. I guess he was in good a shape as he could be. Excuse me, but these are the facts that you may or may not see. They'll be glorified by the media because he's a Democrat and because the media is sole supportive of the Democratic Party. Not healthy. If this was a Republican, I would be saying exactly the same things. Thomas Jefferson, the democracy will cease to exist when you take away from those who are willing to work and give to those who would not. Thomas Jefferson, 1780. Excuse me. It is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes, a principle which, if acted on, would save 1/2 the wars of the world. Remember, wars are generally fought over economics. Another thing that history has done conveniently for the politically correct is to make it strictly over slavery. It was also very strongly done because the North was playing with getting their cotton and tobacco from other countries. Uh-oh, Matt, Will. Pollen, I guess, huh? Excuse me again. Thomas Jefferson, I predict future happiness for Americans if they can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them. John Kennedy, a man does what he must in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles and dangers and pressures. And that is the basis of all human morality. I wonder if these are talked about in the classrooms. That concerns me because I know they're not. Here's something that we've known what's gone on in France. We've had other presidents lately spend their time apologizing for how bad we've been. I don't care if it's the Japanese, the French, our previous president made a habit of bowing and apologizing for America. But he's so popular and so politically correct, the press never found any fault with that. Well, when JFK sent Secretary of State Dean Rusk over to France in the early 60s, now these are the things that when they talk about fake news today, and again, forget whether you like the president, forget whether you like Donald Trump. This is not what it's about. I cringe, I have, over the president many times. But I respect, as everyone should be respecting the office. And there should be a limit in the minds of people. Adults should be telling kids when they know they're going over the top and allowing this bunch of jackals that are now in the mainstream media. I'm not hedging around. I throw my hat right into the ring. I'm not here to be popular, but I am here to be informative. And I'm not here to take on the Democrats or to support the Republicans. I'm here to take on the dangerous situation that John Kennedy would recognize. That's why I parallel. So would his brother Bob. This is not the country that I grew up in, and many of you that hopefully are still watching that you grew up with. We are supposed to have come in and become adults by saying, We're supposed to leave the world a better place, leave this country a better place than it was when we got here. We're so far away from that now, it's pathetic. And it's because we've created a nation of enablers. Enablers. Don't have to work, we'll take care of you. Don't have to say, I'm a first generation, I keep saying it on this program, I'm a first generation immigrant. My father came over here with his father and mother, his father I should say, my grandmother was already here, when he was 4 years old. The rules were you had to have a sponsor to get here. You had to have a job. You had to fill out the paperwork. You had to have a physical. You had to have a place to live. And that sponsor had to answer for your behavior. This idea that people can come into this place, this country, this wonderful place, illegally, and then we have Democrats that want to give them sanctuary, and we have young people thinking it's so unkind if we don't. I ask people all the time, young and old, you go to a Patriots game and you've bought tickets and you go in there and two foreigners are sitting in your ticket. Are you going to say it's okay? Of course you're not. They didn't pay. They don't have the seat. They don't have the right to the seat. I got to calm my voice down. This is exactly what we have in this illegal immigration now. And I, for one, am not only appalled, but I feel it's insane. Just because of the simple analogy I gave you. Why should anyone else, why should people be able to be pulled over by the police that have no license and have no insurance, as many illegals have done? And the police don't arrest them, not because they don't want to, but because they're freed when they go to court. The police officer has to make out the reports, go through all that paperwork, only to find out the judge lets them go. Well, anyway, Dean Rusk was in France in the early 60s when de Gaulle decided to pull out of NATO. Now notice, we're not the only ones. Trump is talking about pulling out of NATO. NAFTA, do you think he's the only one? You listen to the press. You listen to the press. You'd think that Trump is breaking all the rules that have ever been made, which is such a bold-faced lie. Anyway, de Gaulle said he wanted all U.S. military out of France as soon as possible. Secretary Rice responded by saying, "Does that include all those who are buried here?" De Gaulle never said another word. Now, I've been fortunate to go to Europe, and I've gone to Flanders Field, and I've gone to these military cemeteries in France, in Normandy. The most spiritual experience I have ever had in my life. Those that have gone will know. Total silence, all these rows and rows and rows of white, pure white crosses. And total silence, all you can hear are the birds chirping. And those are young Americans that so many years later, the Vietnam soldiers who came home and were spit upon, those soldiers and sailors and Air Force, they're sleeping there without their family ever being able to see them again, to bury them at home. And we're not supposed to remember that on Memorial Day? Never mind our own local cemeteries. What about those hundreds of thousands of American young men? They never had a chance to have a car, to have a family, to own a business. Now, educators telling our young people this? John Kennedy was a graduate of Harvard University now. It was Harvard College when I first. The president of Harvard during George Bush II's term run in this liberal, politically correct, nonsensical, unproductive, disarray liberalism would not allow recruiters on the quad at Harvard. Now, they allowed every other weird group to hand out pamphlets, whether it be a sexual group or some other form, but they would not let our handsome and beautiful young men and women in their dress uniforms who were there to hand out pamphlets and interview prospective Harvard students to serve their country. And to his credit, George Bush II heard about that, called the president of Harvard and informed him that it was either him or her, there was a female, again politically correct, in Harvard. No, I'm not against having women, so don't go there. But whoever the president was, he said, if you want to continue getting federal funding, you better allow those recruiters on the campus. Harvard yielded. But that's not the point. The point is there should have been a punishment, and the point is I don't know why Harvard keeps getting federal funds or any of them. But they do. Harvard's got like $61 billion in endowment funds. You talk about, and I keep harping at it as a former educator, the costs of tuition to our young people, it's immoral and outrageous. Anyway, when in England at a fairly large conference, Colin Powell was asked by the Archbishop of Canterbury if our plans for Iraq were just an example of empire building by George Bush. You see, we've got people in this country, thanks to our college professors, some, who badmouth their own country and call us imperialists. Anyway, Colin Powell was the Secretary of State at that time, and the Archbishop of Canterbury answered, posed that question, and Colin Powell said, over the years, the United States has sent many of its fine young men and women into great peril to fight for freedom beyond our borders. The only amount of land we have ever asked for in return is enough to bury those who did not return. You could have heard a pin drop at that meeting. There was a conference in France where a number of international engineers were taking part, including French and American. And during a break, one of the French engineers came back into the room saying, "Have you heard the latest dumb stunt Bush has done? He has sent an aircraft carrier to Indonesia to help the tsunami victims. What did he intend to do? Bomb them?" Who's this sound like? This doesn't sound like a French politician that doesn't like America. This sounds like our TV news reporters calling the president dumb. By the way, the president, of course, happened to be a Democrat again. But an engineer for Boeing stood up and replied quietly, "Our carriers have 3 hospitals on board that can treat several hundred people. They are nuclear powered and can supply emergency electrical power to shore facilities. They have 3 cafeterias with the capacity to feed 3,000 people 3 meals a day. They can produce several thousand gallons of fresh water from seawater each day, and they carry half a dozen helicopters for use in transporting victims and the injured to and from their flight deck. We have 11 such ships. How many does France have?" You could have heard a pin drop. Does this get reported in the news? In America? Oh, heaven forbid we make our armed services look good. Heaven forbid we make our people in blue look good. It's always the fault. No matter what nitwit either attacks a police officer or a soldier, it's always a reported mistake by the people in power. A U.S. Navy admiral was attending a naval conference that included admirals from the U.S., England, Canadian, Australian, and French navies. At a cocktail reception, he found himself standing with a large group of officers that included personnel from most of those countries. Everyone was chatting away in English as they sipped their drinks. But a French admiral suddenly complained that whereas Europeans learn many languages, Americans learn only English. So in front of the group, he then asked, "Why is it that we always have to speak English in these conferences rather than speaking French?" Without hesitating, the American admiral stood, replied, "Maybe it's because the Brits, the Canadians, the Aussies, and Americans arranged it so you wouldn't have to speak German." You could have heard a pin drop. These are all the things that America takes out of jealousy, and our own press has taken the side of the foreign dignitary rather than our own. Unless it's a Democrat president, then he can do no wrong. Robert Whiting, an elderly gentleman of 83, arrived in Paris by plane. At French customs, he took a few minutes to locate his passport in his carry-on. "You have been to France before, monsieur?" the customs officer asked sarcastically. I've been to Paris, let me tell you, they're still sarcastic. Mr. Whiting, an 83-year-old man, remember, admitted that he had been to France previously. "Then you should know enough to have your passport ready." The 83-year-old American said, "Well, the last time I was here, I didn't have to show it." "Impossible," the Frenchman says. "Americans always have to show their passports on arrival in France." The American senior gave the Frenchman a long, hard look, then he quietly explained, "Well, when I came ashore at Omaha Beach on D-Day in 1944 to help liberate this country, I couldn't find a single Frenchman to show my passport to." You could have heard a pin drop. This is what we have, ladies and gentlemen, in the kind of biased reporting that's so dangerous. That, as I say, this little show, this one person trying to at least inform, not changing your minds, just inform, and let you use the brain God gave you, young and old. We have foundations collapsing. I saw it happening in schools when I was teaching 35, 40 years ago. When every kid has to get a trophy. You can't give F's anymore. It's too traumatic. You can't play dodgeball. All that nonsense. Remember, we're getting away from religion, and one of the things that I believe the underlying causes are the things, the universals that we all, my age and others, grew up with, those that are churchgoers. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's not diddly-dinking around the subject. That's direct. Charity begins at home. Explain to me, both parties, why I am apolitical. Why are we giving billions and billions of dollars to countries who hate us? And then the news reports that our Social Security is in jeopardy? Why do we have our military waiting for health care coverage, waiting for money, when we are allowing people who come in here illegally, we give them a check and they get free health care? Now, if that isn't insane, I just rest my case. How are we doing now? We've got 5 minutes? Oh, good. So we're almost done. Well, I hope you've gained something for this, but my big point is I've had a really interesting life. I've done a lot of things, made a lot of friends, still do. I'm not Will Rogers. You know, I never met a man I didn't like. Well, that's not so. But I've met so many I really care for. And most of all, I care about the future for our young people. By young, I mean in their 30s and 40s who are being exposed to this terribly, terribly disrespectful and dangerous road the television media is producing. It's not right. And the fact that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated, his life was taken at 46, and the fact that he will be remembered as this stellar Democrat and make it look as though he made this country the way it is now, he would not any way follow this. So I thank you. God bless you. Happy Memorial Day. Have a nice time with your family, but I hope you'll remember at 3 o'clock to stop and pause and thank all those hundreds of thousands of men and women who sacrificed so that you and your grandkids and your kids can have what we all are so blessed with. God bless America and God bless you. I'm Don McKeag.